what I want to know from all of you is where your love of food and cooking comes from. I know for you, Anand, it was very much to do with your father and Kerala.
I come from Kerala, Cochin, and my love for food starts from my home, my kitchen, like my mother's kitchen. So that's where I started. So I come from a culture where men never entered kitchen. So I could see what my mom was cooking. And my father's experience of taking me to small tea shops and restaurant, that's where I experienced the love for food and my passion for it.
Caroline, for you, of course, your book is slightly different, although it also does contain recipes. It's more of a travelogue, and it's a personal journey too. But taking it back to those early roots, where do you think that adventurism that you exhibit in your writing comes from when it concerns food?
Thank you. I think it does come from my childhood, though I didn't grow up. I'm not one of those food writers that grew up with my mother in the kitchen. My mother worked, and we'd have a lot of frozen meals for dinner in the 80s, but we had Iranian and Turkish neighbors. And my parents loved our neighbors, and we would go there and share meals, and they would tell us their stories, and it was a kind of exchange. And I think that was the spark for me, that growing up in Reading, which is like 30 miles outside of London, there was a whole other world out there of delicious, interesting things and fabulous people to go and meet. So I think for me, that's where it started.
And Susan, for you, I mean, your book is very much about fried chicken, and that's been a huge love of your life.
Well, the first recipe that I learned from my mother was fried chicken, and it's the first recipe in my book. I call it Mom's Fried Chicken. Both my parents were fantastic cooks, but my grandmother was the most amazing Chinese cook. Every Saturday and every Sunday, a Saturday dinner and Sunday lunch, she would cook for around 25 family members, and I would help out in the kitchen, and I'm very grateful for that.
I mean, I'm really interested just to delve into the person that made you love food. Tell us a little bit more about your grandmother and what it was about her that really transmitted that love of food to you.
Well, there's an expression in Chinese it says "ayi leng tong," which means a second wife's soup. My grandmother was a second wife. We didn't find out that my grandfather had a first wife in China. And so the saying means that the second wife's soup has to be better than any other soup because it's what attracts the husband. So she has to please the husband in a way that the first wife doesn't, because she's the second wife. She's lower in status. And it was common in those days to have more than one wife. And my grandmother was just the most extraordinary cook. She would cook the most intricate dinners, and I found out afterwards when I moved to Hong Kong that they were unusual in their intricacy. They were very old-fashioned. And so she just made really delicious, very old-fashioned, very labor-intensive dishes. And it was a way, in her way, to keep her husband.
And your dad, Anand, I mean, he was a great foodie. He used to take you to restaurants all the time.
Yes. So basically, I come from two different Christian cultures. One is Syrian Christian, which is considered to be the Hindu Nambudris, Brahmins who were converted into Christianity by St. Thomas, AD 52, that's what they say. And my mother's side is Latin Christian, which were converted by the Portuguese. So both their culture of food and everything was different. And eating around in small street food shops in Cochin. And if I talk about Cochin in a 5-kilometer radius, I could say there are 40 different communities. And 40 different communities all came to Cochin because of the trade of the port. And they came from different parts of India, different parts of the world. And what they did was they brought their food and culture back into Cochin, evolved and revolved with what we had with the climate. Like we got beautiful seafood there, rice there, and again, the economic conditions. Like certain dishes, we got some dish called savola bhajia. It looks like a donut. So where it was invented, if you ask, it might be a bread dough. One clever cook would have been made into a donut. So there are fantastic dishes, which is very cost effective and for the time. So I've experienced all these things with my father before even I went into the culinary world.
Why was he taking you to restaurants? I mean, obviously he liked going himself, but he didn't want you to be a chef. So what was his purpose?
No, his way of showing love was that. So that's the way he showed us affection, buying things. So that's where he made me experience so many things. Even when I was a young boy, he made me independent. So that the things you do it yourself and you learn your way. So that was his way of showing his affection and love.
Yeah, yeah. Caroline, we remember that in the UK in the 70s and 80s, food was kind of brown and beige and bland. And as you say, you were lucky enough to have neighbours that didn't eat in that way. Was there a personality in particular that really fired your love of culinary difference?
I came to food quite late, so I'd say it's 10, 12 years ago I became very interested in food. But when I was small, the Turkish lady who ran the household was called Irmak, and she was from Istanbul. And I always say I think Istanbul, forgive me, is the world's greatest kitchen. And I go there a few times every year to eat and to hang out with my friends there. And I do think Irmak probably sowed the seed, and she's still alive, and my dad and her are still friends. So I think just growing up in that kind of multicultural community was really good for me. It opened my eyes.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about people's home regions. Reading doesn't particularly have anything to recommend it, I'm sorry to say, in terms of food. But your travels have taken you to so many places, and your book picks up. I mean, from Russia to Istanbul to all sorts of different places. And I wanted to zero in on one particular foodstuff, and that's the melon.
The Uzbek melon. So it's weird. I've kind of become known for being a kind of small expert on the Uzbek winter melon. It's an extraordinary fruit. I wrote an FT article about this a few years ago, and people were really fascinated by it. They've got 160 different names for these winter melons. They're often very wrinkly, or they're different shapes and sizes. Uzbeks really understand the value of fruits. The Fergana Valley was where Babur left his homeland, came to India, missed the fruit of Uzbekistan. And it's a wonderful taste. And of course, when you eat something in an orchard or close to where it's come from, the flavor's much better than if it's traveled. So my opening chapter in Cold Kitchen, my new book, is about me slicing up a melon in my cold basement Edinburgh kitchen. But I'm thinking about these wonderful melons of Uzbekistan. And it's that feeling of how food can transport you, how the kitchen is a portal to other places, to other worlds, and to other people, and a sort of memory box. And sometimes all it takes is the feel of a peppercorn or the smell of a melon, and you travel. I do really believe this. It's the wonderful power of food.
I mean, you write, the kitchen is a space that effectively opens up the world. Is that the case for you?
Well, yes, I do think so, because without all my friends, wouldn't have tasted so many different foods. Without moving from United States to Hong Kong, I wouldn't have tasted so many delicious things. And the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know, because there's so many different types of cuisine I don't know. There are a lot of cuisines that I do know and which I can cook, but there's so much that I want to learn, and I'm never going to learn it all, but I hope to learn a lot of it.
What about your own personal kitchen? What does that mean to you?
Well, I cook a lot of food for my husband because he likes certain things. So when I cook for him, I cook one type of food. He's a Brit, and so he likes simpler foods, but he likes spicy foods as well. But when I cook for myself, I can cook anything. I can cook Korean, I can cook Chinese, I can cook French, I can cook Italian. I can't cook Indian, and I'd love to learn. But the one thing that I think he fell in love with was my pastries, because I used to be a pastry chef, and he does like my desserts.
And for you, of course, you have a home kitchen, but you also run an incredibly successful restaurant. And I wonder how a restaurant kitchen differs from a home kitchen in the feeling that you, as the cook, has about the space in which you're creating this food.
So the restaurant, we have to bring that commercial element into it. So the classical training gives you that part. But when we did the restaurant, so when I went to Cardiff, the Indian food scene was totally different. It was a Bangladeshi run curry house to where it is. So there was no a fine dining element of Indian cuisine as such, where we could pair the wines with the food and more like an experience rather than eating food. So what we did is we took the classical dishes. So my restaurant is called the Purple Papadum, where we say it's modern Indian with strong, bold Kerala flavors. So if we have to create a fish curry, rather than soaking the fish or poaching the fish in the sauce, we try to bring into a three-dimension way of bringing a starch at the bottom, the sauce, and the fancier fish. So, but all the elements of the curry are brought in. So that's an element of art into that as well. But again, from a practicality, when the guest sits in the restaurant, we need to create the dish in 10-15 minutes time. So we need to work a backward synergy of the practicality, how much we can prep, and how do we create the dishes. So some dishes like my mom did was so much laborious, which is not possible, but which can be done on a banqueting, which cannot be run on a restaurant service where you got tables ordering different foods, and again, the space of the kitchen. So the practicality comes in quite a lot. But when you ask me, kitchen is that's my space. And the food, what I cook, is who I am. And that's what I can reflect to anyone rather than saying bold flavors. But when you take a spoon of it, you can understand what I'm trying to achieve. That's the advantage, and that's a capacity, ability of the food can do to
Whereas for you, Caroline, your kitchen is much more of a meditative space, isn't it? You're really thinking about what you're doing. You're really taking time. Turning something around in 15 minutes would seem to me, from reading your book and exploring that space with you through the eyes of your dog as well, that kind of fast turnaround would be impossible.
I'm quite a slow cook. I like to have the radio on and sort of take my time over it. And the kitchen for me, it was a place where life happens. And when I moved to Edinburgh 10 years ago, it was around the time of the Scottish referendum, and the house prices were quite affordable. And I saw this kitchen, and it's subterranean, so it's under the cobblestones of Edinburgh. And I just thought, this is where all life will happen. This is where the comings and the goings will happen. It's where the dinner parties will happen. So when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine happened, for example, I held 2 supper clubs and charged a fee, which felt quite odd for me because, I don't charge people to come and have dinner with me usually, but we raised quite a lot of money, and I would recreate recipes that I'd collected from my time in Ukraine, and I'd have Ukrainian wines and a cocktail I'd come up with for my book, Black Sea. And so it can be different depending on what's happening. But I have a little office off the kitchen where I write, and then I have another little pantry off the kitchen as well. And the pantry, I really treat it like a library. I go in there and I treat the things with a reverence like they're books, because it's a curious thing what's in the pantry if you think about it. There are shells, there are seeds, there are the spines of the sardines. It's like all life is there, barks, leaves. And I think it's quite a philosophical space, the kitchen. It makes you think about where things have come from. And I think I'm quite lucky I don't have children, and I can sort of spend hours thinking about these things and preparing meals. But yeah, there's something about going down into that kitchen and it becomes a thoughtful space.
And how about for you, Susan? Because you've spent a lifetime writing about food. Does that change the way you think about cooking?
When I was food and wine editor for the South China Morning Post, I had to cook for my audience because I had a weekly recipe column, and I had to test a recipe, decide on a recipe, test it again possibly, and write for my audience. And it had to be really precise. I had to measure things, and I'm not used to measuring things. When I cook for myself, I just do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, which is how my mother taught me how to cook. But you can't tell a reader a little bit of this and a little bit of that. You have to be precise. So now that I'm no longer food and wine editor, I can cook for myself. I can cook what I want to cook. And it is very different because for me, all that matters is deliciousness. It doesn't have to be something new, which is what I had to come up with every week with a new recipe. It's what I like to eat now, and I'm actually very happy about that.
Yeah. And your book is called The 5,000 Mile Journey, and of course 5,000 miles from Kerala to Cardiff. Can you take us through that journey?
So I'm a commerce graduate, then I wanted to become a chef. So, but then I worked for a year, then I went to a culinary school to be trained as chef. Then I worked.
I've got to stop you there. How did you convince your parents? Because they were dead set against you doing
My
this.
father was against it, but then they said, you do whatever you want. And whoever I spoke to, they said I'm mad because after graduation in commerce, you're going to do again a bachelor's. And the training, the way the kitchen chefs were trained, it was hard. And like it's 15 to 18 hours. So they said you won't survive. And I took it as a challenge. And I went to one of the best schools in India, Taj School, Aurangabad, where I did my culinary and I trained. And I worked in Taj, Oberoi and Leela's. So that gave me a fantastic exposure. I even had an opportunity to work in Ranthambore. So I understand a bit of Rajasthani food culture. Then I ended up in everyone's dreamland, London. That's where the chef's dream is. But I ended up in a restaurant called Vineet Bhatia's restaurant. So that's where I started. So that was a one-star Michelin. And that's where I saw the food can be presented this way. I didn't stay much there. I was there only for 3 months because they put me in desserts. Dessert was something I would eat. Then I had opportunity to meet investors who took me. We ended up in Cardiff. People asked me, how did you land up in Cardiff? I said the investors wanted to open a restaurant and we could find a place in Cardiff. And that's where it all started.
Because this is not your first restaurant, is it?
No, the first one.
Can I just ask you to bring your mic a little bit closer?
Oh, the first restaurant was called the Minted Mustard, which we opened in 2007. And I was with them for three and a half years. And that time we took that restaurant into top 100 restaurants in UK. And we changed the food scene in Cardiff. And 2011, I moved out to open Purple Papadum. And Purple Papadum is still there for last 14 years, growing stronger. I got a good team of chefs who's with me for 14, 15 years.
And of course, you've had fantastic reviews and you've won various prizes. But Susan, you're the type, you write reviews, as do you. So tell us about reviewing restaurants and how that sort of impacts. I mean, how have reviews impacted you?
To some extent, we read it, we go through it, but we don't try to influence by, them. So a lot of the people try to do, like when I do a Kerala interpretation of food, a lot of times people don't understand the flavors or what we are trying to do. So some reviewers, before writing, they'll have a word with us saying that, what was your approach for this? Why did you do that? Some write. Very few people write literally blunt, but there are now a lot of food bloggers who will write and who we don't even bother. Because we must still look into it. If there is positive criticism, it's something which can be improved, definitely we look into it. Certain things they say is impossible. Because I don't know what culture they are coming from or what background. I have to look into. I got a 70-cover restaurant. On a busy night, we do 200 covers. So we do it 3 times. So we have to. There will be a little bit of mistakes going there, but we'll try to make it better.
So as reviewers, how do you approach this? And I wonder also if the rise of the food blogger and influencers and so on has affected your trade.
I don't really write restaurant reviews per se, but I do often include a restaurant in my books, but there has to be a story. There has to be a reason for me to include the restaurant. So one example I can think of, the book that I wrote about Central Asia opens in Kazakhstan and opens in a very remote town called Aktau, which is on the Caspian Sea. And there's a restaurant there called Barashka. And it's run by a guy whose parents came from Baku in Azerbaijan across the Caspian Sea, and they arrived to build the city because it was part of the Soviet Union. That's interesting, so I want to know about that. So I sat down with the owner and he told me about his family history and how they'd come and how he includes flavors from Azerbaijan into his Kazakh kitchen. So if there's a story like that, I'm interested. I don't really do standard restaurant reviewing, but I love the stories of the people in the kitchen.
Susan, tell me how you approach reviewing.
I did a weekly restaurant review, and honestly, it was my least favorite part of the job. Everybody thinks that restaurant reviewing is glamorous. You know, I would do most of them anonymously until my face got too well known so that I couldn't do it anonymously. But it's a big, you have to take it very, very seriously. And I think because I was a chef before, I took it really, really seriously. I didn't want to say anything that was inaccurate, of course, but I also felt sensitivity towards the chef. And if there was review that was so bad that I couldn't say anything positive, I didn't write it. I didn't finish the review. I didn't publish the review. Unless it was a big name. Like when Gordon Ramsay came to Hong Kong and I thought the food was very mediocre. When Jamie Oliver came to Hong Kong and I thought his restaurant was very mediocre. Because they're big names and they're established, I think they're fair game. But if they were just a person just trying to start a restaurant because he loved it, I wouldn't write it. I wouldn't run the review if I didn't like it.
Who are you writing the review for? Is it for foodies or is it for us ordinary public members who want to decide where to have supper tonight? Because those are two different audiences, really.
There's different ways of looking at restaurant review or reviewing. The New York Times goes several times, tries to be anonymous, tries to eat everything on the menu. And then there's the other way, which is you give it one visit, and which is the way most people eat. If you go to a restaurant and you don't like it, you're going to tell your friends, I didn't like this restaurant. Or if you like it, you will go back again. So I approached it in the second way, because people give it one chance. And if you get it wrong, it's not your fault, it's their fault. They can say, oh, I'm sorry, but we're new, or the chef was off that day. I'm sorry, but if you're paying the same amount of money that everybody would pay, and the chef isn't in the kitchen and the food is bad, that's not their fault. And they're paying the same amount as they would, as anybody else would. So that's really unfair. You should, if the food isn't good enough when the chef isn't there, then you should say, I'm sorry, but we're only taking a certain number of people, or we'll have the price.
Gosh, that's so interesting. We were talking about journeys, your 5,000-mile journey. And Caroline, your book obviously is very much involved in travel. And in fact, you had this wonderful quote from a Russian about arrivals and departures. I wonder if you'd talk to us about that.
I think all of us who are lucky enough to have a home and have our own kitchens, I think it is where these departures and arrivals often happen. We often greet someone, you sit down, you have a cup of tea, you recount the stories, and it's often where we say goodbye as well. And that lovely quote sort of sums that up, I think. It's where life happens. It's where the comings and goings happen. I think it is the heart of a home, a kitchen. And a kitchen doesn't have to be grand. My kitchen's not grand. It's unchanged from when I moved in 10 years ago. I haven't really done anything to it. But it's somewhere, obviously, you feel very connected with, because you'll have a birthday celebration there, or you might mourn somebody around the table together, or you bring people together. And it's where the arrivals and departures happen, the kitchen, I think.
And of course, Susan, you've moved, like Anand, miles and miles away from your home. And I wondered if you'd talk to us about that transition from California to Hong Kong.
Living in California is very different, obviously, from living in the United States or living in Hong Kong. But in between, I moved to New York, from California to New York to Hong Kong. So fortunately, I got used to very small kitchens when I was living in New York. My mother's kitchen in California was quite big. My kitchen in New York was very, very small. And my kitchen in Hong Kong, my first kitchen in Hong Kong, was so small that I could touch both walls like this. Didn't have to stretch out my arms. I've since graduated to a marvelous professional kitchen. I can cook anywhere. I can cook in the small kitchen, but I enjoy cooking in a comfortable kitchen, and that's what I have now.
I want to talk a little bit about love and food, Anand, and about how it's different when you cook for people that you love.
So food has got something called the emotion. Like when our moms cook for us, or someone who loves us cook food, they don't buy the most expensive ingredients or elements into it. They cook it in such a way that, oh, I got some guests in, they're very close to me, and they put that affection and love, and that transforms to food, and that carries through the food. So when my mom was making food for us, she thought it's for my kids, it's for the family. And that affection and emotion carries through food. But in the commercial world, we struggle this. Even though we got recipes in, everything like what Susan said, I exactly run restaurant with grams and liter. And the biggest thing which we have in the kitchen is a measuring scale. We have a lot of them, so that the boys don't go wrong in measuring. But still that environment to create that affection, to do that, we still try our level best to deliver in the restaurant, but it's a challenge.
Caroline, how would you address the same question, food and love?
I think for me, it's an acknowledgement of these countries that I've spent a lot of time in over the last 15 years. So I only write about the region between Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And for me, it's remembering the people I've met there or spent time with. Sometimes it's an artist I love that I've discovered there. Sometimes it's another writer who's written about food. I often dedicate a recipe to a writer. In my books, I bring back writers who have sort of fallen out fashion. I like to do that. So for me, it's a bit more abstract. It's a sort of love letter to these countries and to the people I've met, perhaps shared a meal with. And it's a way of staying connected somehow to these places and the people that have helped me to write my books.
And Susan, of course, you've been a pastry chef. Now, my partner who's in the audience here is a baker. And of course, working with dough, you work with pastry, it's not dissimilar. And
We had a long conversation yesterday.
well, I'm just wondering about, because I sometimes feel that in his bread, I can taste the emotion that he's been feeling when he's kneaded the dough. And I wonder if that's something that you acknowledge and perhaps you feel through pastry. And as you were saying, your partner loves you, I'm sure, for many reasons, but your pastry is one of them.
Well, I love to work with doughs, and I have a mixer, a stand mixer, but when I make bread, I love to have my hands in it. And just because you need to feel the dough, you need to read the dough, because every dough is different. Even if you use the same ingredients, the same measurements, from day to day it will be different because of the weather, because of, I don't know, the movement of the stars or whatever. I don't know what it is, but I make the same bread at least once a week, and every time it's different. And you just have to understand the dough. You just read it, and to me it's really fascinating. And I make for my husband every year a tea party for 60. And it takes at least a week to start preparing. I plan all the guests, I plan how much I'm baking, and it's a labor of love.
Does it taste different if you've made it for someone you love?
I don't know about that. He says yes. I hope so.
Anand, you told me that you accidentally wrote a book. How does anyone do that?
No, there was a Welsh company who was doing another book, and I was associated with them. So I had 10 pages to do it. And he literally pursued me saying that, why don't you do a book? I can help you out. And that's where it all started. And then he drafted me a basic kind of structure. This is the way the book looks. Then literally I worked for a year on it. And when the book came out, it was not what he wrote. It was totally different, even the front page. So we did the first part of the book talks about my story, where I lived in Cochin, my home, and even the pictures were all done in Cochin. And one of the photo shoots when we were coming out, there was a small toddy shop, and I sat in front of the toddy shop in a normal lungi. And that is the front page of my book, the 5,000 by. So he inspired me to do it, but by years of experience and the things I've learned from. And there are a lot of mistakes I made in the book. Even though we proofread it, I did the recipe 3 times, 4 times, but still I could see that there are mistakes. So, but that's the way you learn. And it ended up, I published in 2016, and it opened me a different doors. And even understanding the culture, the Portuguese colonization, and I'm even looking into a next part of a career, which I can do another book as well.
And Caroline, your writing came out of being a jobbing journalist, but you were nearly not here to write at all. I'm thinking about you planning to go to Nepal.
Oh, you mean the time I had a near accident? Yeah, I was in Nepal, and I tried to fly up to Everest Base Camp to do a trek, and I kept going to the airport, and the plane kept getting delayed, and I actually ended up going to Bangladesh instead. I love Calcutta. I thought I want to see what Bangladesh is like, and when I landed, everyone was getting in touch with me because the plane had finally taken off, but it had crashed, and everyone inside the plane had been killed, including several young British people who were going there to do this trek. So the start of the memoir mentions this, because I don't know, it happened, I didn't really think about it, but it's travel is sometimes a bit dicey. Obviously, it's the road travel which tends to worry me the most, but yeah.
So tell us then about the evolution from writing travel pieces into this full-blown, beautiful book.
So I used to write a lot of travel articles, and of course you write a lot about the food. It's really easy, it's sort of easier to walk into a market or a restaurant, get quotes, talk to people, get some colour. But I was very frustrated that back in, say, 2012, 2014, I was traveling to countries like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, amazing countries, very rich culture, very interesting food, but people were very disparaging about it because the tourism infrastructure wasn't there. A lot of these places suffered very much after the fall of the Soviet Union, and it wasn't always easy to have a delicious meal in a cafe or a restaurant, but in people's homes, of course the food's interesting and very delicious. And so I got into this in a way as a sort of rebuke to these guidebooks, these men who'd written these guidebooks, to say, actually, you're wrong. I don't eat a great deal of meat, and I've never gone hungry in Central Asia, and there are these amazing stories to be told. Now it's becoming a more popular destination for people to visit. So that's really where it began. I published a book called Samarkand in 2016, and then have been writing those sorts of books ever since, which I call travel logs with recipes, because I think recipes are like postcards. You send them to people, they do their own thing with them, and they're like another way to tell the story, to taste the journey. It's sort of three-dimensional, and I liked that idea, because sometimes travel books are quite detached, they're a bit grand, and I thought if you use food, it brings people in, and then you can tell them about the gulags or the sad stories and the serious stuff, because you can tell any story through food. It doesn't have to all be about love, and it can't always be just about love and the good stuff. It has to be honest, so you tell the other stories as well about war and hunger and everything.
Your book reminds me a little of Nora Ephron's Heartburn, which of course is about love and relationship breakup. But as you say, it's a wonderful way to get into the subject. And at the end of every chapter, there it is, the recipe, the thing you eat when you need scrambled egg for one or a watermelon and feta salad, as you have with mint.
I think there's a real generosity with food writing. I think writing a recipe is extremely difficult. Like, I write book reviews for quite grand publications, fine. Writing a recipe is really difficult. You have to be precise. Someone's going to spend the money and the time and the energy and feed it to their family. You better get it right, because people will write and tell you if you get it wrong. It's a real skill. So I have great admiration for recipe writers and people who are much better at it than me. I mean, I'm just a home cook, so.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to know more about that, Susan, because of course your book, Kung Pao and Beyond, is essentially about one type of food, but you've written so many recipes around that. So how do you start crafting a recipe? What is the art of recipe writing?
Well, I did it for so long with the SCMP, and like we've all been saying that it's all about precision. You want it to be right, otherwise the person who's making your recipe will get it. It won't be delicious. But I love it when people take my recipes and riff off it. There was a recipe that I gave yesterday for in the Friends of the Festival lounge. It was the salt and pepper wings. I chose that recipe because salt and pepper, they're seasonings that are universal. There are probably very, very few cultures that don't use salt and pepper. And so I said to them, please, if the chefs want to change it, I'm happy to let them change it. Please don't take the recipe as it's written in stone. If you taste it and you think, oh, it needs a little bit of chili, they should add chili. And I really like it when they do that. I really loved it when people would write to me and say, I made your recipe, but I changed it a little bit. You know, and they're almost apologetic about it, but they shouldn't be. They should make it their own.
I mean, Caroline's right, the generosity of somebody doing that. I can imagine somebody having completely the opposite reaction. If you're making Susan's chicken and this doesn't taste like Susan's chicken, that could be a huge affront, but it's not.
It's not. I was in Vietnam a couple weeks ago, and the chefs they knew I was coming, so they made some of my recipes, and they made my mom's wings. In the book, I asked for kikkoman soy sauce because kikkoman seems to be pretty universal. It's sold in so many different countries. And I tasted it and I said, did you use Vietnamese soy sauce? And they said yes, and they were almost apologetic about it. And I said, no, I'm really glad you did. It tastes different. It tastes distinctively different, but it's still delicious. And as long as it's delicious, that's all that matters.
And give us your take on that, about people changing your recipes, and also how you start when you begin to craft a recipe.
So we do master classes, so I teach people cooking classes as well. So when they come in, we try to do dishes which is very simple. We teach them how the techniques are. And because if you look at Indian cuisine, there are 3 basic ingredients: turmeric powder, coriander powder, and chili powder. These are the basics, and you play around with this with onion and tomatoes, how you cook it. So we teach them the basic way to do it, and even the recipes, I write it as simple as I can. And they'll try to, and they replicate with us in the class, but if in the book, they do it, and sometimes people write to me saying that we tried it this way, this was a little bit different, and I'm very specific about the brands which we use, the chili powder, the coriander powder, so which I tell them, so these are the differences they make, but everyone has got their own take on, because there's an element of temperature comes in as well, and then again how you chop it, slices, make the final product different as well. This is going very technical. So we try to teach them, which is not much of where we are toasting 13 ingredients, roasting it, grinding into powder and thing. We show them simple poaching way of, there are 3-4 ingredients in, temper it and cook it, and they can create it. And with their basic thing, I even measure the salt and water to them. That is my problem, being a chef. But which they can play around with. Some like the sauce to be thinner, thicker, and I say that use the way you want it in your personal day-to-day life.
Caroline, if you had to choose one recipe and its accompanying story out of your book, what would that be?
So while my book travels out to all these places, there is also a chapter in the book on Scotland, and I find a cloudberry. Cloudberries are very, very rare in the UK. They're much more commonly found in Scandinavia and Russia. But I was out hill walking in a very remote part of Scotland, and I found this one cloudberry. A bird must have dropped the seed. It was a remarkable moment to find it. And when I came back down off the hill, I collected a lot of bilberries, which are like blueberries, and I made a jam of a kind of like a memento of that great day that I had. And that chapter is really lovely because it sort of describes the heather at the time of year. And I wanted to have something from Scotland as well in the book. So I think it's the bilberry jam, which you can also make with blueberries. It's what we call nearly jam. So you don't have to have a firm set. It's really good on buttered toast.
How about you, Susan? Your favorite recipe from the book, and also what the story behind that recipe is. What makes it to your best?
It would be the first recipe in the book, Mom's Wings. As I said, it's the first. Sorry. Okay. As I said, it's Mom's Wings is the first recipe that my mother taught me how to cook, and it's the first fried chicken recipe that I learned, and it started a love for fried chicken. So I made it because it was my mother made this recipe or this dish for me and my brothers when we were growing up, and I made it for her about a year after the book. No, when the book came out, and I said, "Oh, Mom, I'm making you this," and I fed it to her, and she said, "Oh, it tastes like my wings," and I said, "It is your wings." So I'm really glad I was able to make it for her. She's almost 90, and she still loves to eat, and I'm just very grateful that I was able to cook it for her.
And Anand, which would you choose, and what's the story?
It's a biryani. So from a childhood, that was my favorite dish. And with my travels, I've eaten the best, lot of biryani. And for me, the best biryani which I've eaten is in Aisha Manzil, one of the homestays in Kerala. It was in Talasheri, is run by a couple called the Musa family. And they have, that's where I've eaten the best biryani in my life.
I finally want to ask all of you about seasonality. Your book is divided into 4 seasons, and about climate change, because of course what we eat is influencing what's happening to the world around us. And I wonder how much you think about that and how much we ought to be changing our habits to make sure that the planet, that what we grow, that what we consume is still habitable for generations to come. Susan?
Well, with Gong Bao and beyond, I'm afraid that it's not seasonal, and it's probably not sustainable, because I also, you have to balance sustainability with what people can afford. I could have said, and I said this in the introduction, I could say, only use sustainable chicken, only use battery or farm-raised chicken, but people can't always afford that, and it's really unfair because people who can't afford top ingredients have to eat too, and they should be able to eat well. So you have to balance sustainability with what people can afford. And I said in the book, use what you can afford, and I still believe in that.
Caroline?
I think that's right. I also think absolutely everywhere I've travelled, I've heard the same thing from farmers and people in orchards. Everything's changed. People who are in their 50s and 60s say that the harvest isn't as good as it used to, the seasons have changed. They are on the front line in many ways in these remote parts of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. Glaciers are melting. What can we do about it? I don't know, but I think there's a lesson in deliciousness in the sense that if something is home-reared and it's closer to home, it's probably going to taste better than if it's been sat in cold storage and on the back of a truck for many weeks. But again, it's education and it comes down to cost.
And Anand?
I would say that what we do back to the soil. So the fertilizers and things we put, it brings back poison back into the food. So the more natural and the local ingredients we can do and which work seasonally, I would say that is the best way to preserve the culture and the food.
We're going to open the floor up to the audience now. So if you have questions, do give us a wave. We've got a couple of microphones here, and there's a lady right in the front row who has a question.
Hi, am I audible? Okay. Hi, so Caroline, this is for you. I picked up this book the month it was launched. I carried it everywhere, Northeast, etc., and you tweeted about it. I really love the fact that you've mentioned how food makes us more inclusive. Yeah, it brings us really closer, different cultures, etc. So what is your comfort food, I would want to know? And what memory does it evoke for you?
Such a good question. So you know the Uzbek dish plov, which is similar to pilaf? I think it's probably that. I find rice very, very comforting. I also love Indian dal. I make a version I wouldn't be brave enough to share with you here, but I love lentils. I think lentils are deeply comforting. But plov, the layered rice dish, onions, slow cooked with some lamb or with some quail's eggs, sometimes with some fruits through it. I just think rice is the most comforting thing.
Another
Thank
quick
you.
question? Yeah.
Noticed through your presentations that you use the word chef and also the word cook. I have a lot of kind of associations with those two words and the differences between them, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Anand, why don't you take that, chef and cook?
So these are the terms which we use in the industry, and it's the hierarchy in the hierarchy in the trade. So when someone starts, they start with cook. The cook is a person who just cooks the food. And more you climb the ladder, is not just cooking the food. There's a lot of management things comes in where you need to order the stuff, liaise with suppliers, work with the food cost. So it climbs a ladder from a cook to a chef de partie, a sous chef, the ladder goes up. And when you reach more the ladder, is more about the management and rather than the real cooking. Definitely your experience of cooking values in and adds in as well.
Anand, thank you so much.